Hello, this is Will Schlecht from Iron Crow AI, and today I wanted to talk about a new feature, which is the agent mode within the Interrogate tab of the Large Language Model Sandbox. And this feature basically is a bit of an autopilot, although maybe autopilot is too strong of a word. It's a little bit more like a cruise control for your workflows with the Interrogation tab. So usually when you're using the interrogation tab, you've got your documents related to, whatever application you're working on. In this case, I've loaded documents related to an office action in an application. And so that's all the relevant documents, and that's automatically generated by the OA shell tool, but you can also just upload those files manually. And usually the workflow would go something like this. You would select only the relevant document and then say something like, to get yourself contextualized to what's happening with the case, please summarize the substantive issues raised in this office action. So it's a step-by-step process. You're going to give one prompt, get one response, and I think the current best practice is that each of your prompts are fairly specific, fairly narrow. You're trying to achieve just one step forward. Um, so you can see we have our summary of all the substantive issues. That's great, but what the agent mode allows you to do is to kind of specify how to accomplish a more high level task in one prompt. So I've got this prompt here, and what it says is, please analyze the provided office action to determine the primary reference used by the examiner, um, and how it's used in the prior art rejections, and then compare this primary reference to our application to assess if there are any distinctions between our application and the primary reference, or any issues with the examiner's mapping of this reference, and then give it some kind of specifications on how it should support or cite those those sections of the documents that it thinks supports its conclusions. And so you can see that this is much different than how we would usually draft a prompt for the interrogation tab. We're specifying kind of in relatively abstract terms an entire workflow to achieve something, to find issues with the examiner's mapping. Um, you'll notice that this doesn't include the specific names of any of the files. So one advantage to this tool, or this kind of agent mode, is that you're able to use the same prompt in different cases and it will work fairly well because this agent mode is basically able to break down a task into individual steps and execute them. And in this case, what it's going to do is we're asking it to determine the primary reference from the office action. So it will do that. When you're using the interrogation agent mode, you can select all of your context files. And the reason that you can do this is the agent mode is going to dynamically determine which of these sources it needs to query. And therefore, you can just select everything and it will give it the best chance of succeeding. There are some cases where you might still want to limit which files the agent mode is able to access. Say you just want to compare two references, you can just select those two references and nothing else. But I think in general, kind of a benefit to this mode is that you don't have to manually select each document for each prompt. You can just give one high level task and specify everything. So we will submit that. It takes a bit longer to run because it's going to do, basically it's executing a workflow that you would have executed manually. So maybe you would have first summarized the office action, then read that summary, understood which reference was the primary reference, then found that primary reference in the context files, selected it, summarized that reference, then summarized maybe the application, the subject application, and then come to your own conclusion about what the differences are, or maybe ask this tool to kind of summarize some of those differences. But this will essentially do all of that in one shot. Um, and this is just one example. This agent mode is basically able to execute arbitrary workflows based off of a high level task specification. Um, but it requires a little bit of a different technique with how you prompt it. For one thing, I think it's a lot more important that you tell the tool what the files are or how they relate to your case. You can't just give it 100 files and say, uh, do my job for me, or accomplish this task that I haven't really told you how these files relate to that task. So it's a little bit more important that you actually specify how those files relate to the task that you're evaluating. And also it's going to perform better or more to your standard if you give your philosophy of how you want that task to be accomplished. So you can see this is a relatively simple example. I've only asked it to do a process that might take about 3 steps, right? You summarize the office action, you summarize a reference, you summarize your application, and then you synthesize an answer from there. So it's a 3-step task. And I've kind of indicated each of those 3 steps. You can be more vague, but I think to get the output as you would want or as you yourself would produce if you were kind of using this tool manually step by step, it's better to give a little bit more of a detailed philosophy or instructions for how you want the task accomplished. You can really think of it more like working with a colleague, where if you had a new associate and they hadn't, they were a smart person, but they hadn't worked on this particular, field, they haven't worked on patents before or something. You would want to, one, tell them what the files are that you're attaching to the email, and then two, kind of give them a little bit of instruction about how they should go about producing some work product or accomplishing the task. So we can see here that we now have this breakdown basically of the distinctions between our application and that primary reference. So it was able to identify that the primary reference was this Wang reference. It then, went in and compared our application to that reference, citing different portions of that document, which supports its distinctions. I won't go into the details about what it found because that's kind of irrelevant, but it it's good. The output is nice. So it does done a good job. And one additional thing that's different about this is compared to the normal interrogate workflow where you would get citations here, the agent mode will give you its process of how it solved the task. So, step one, it analyzed the office action, and it had a query which was, please analyze the office action to identify the primary reference cited in the prior art rejections. So these are kind of the query is the prompt that you would have put, into the chat and then submitted it to the interrogate tab. But it's kind of doing that automatically. And then you can see what the response was. Sometimes this information can be useful as well. And it's also useful to track how the model went about solving the task that you gave it. So in this case, we can see it summarized the office action to identify the primary reference. Then in the next step, it got the text directly from our application, which is a lot of text. And in the final step, which is somewhere down here. Yeah, it's a little bit tedious to go through all this. Okay, in the final step, it got context directly from the Wang document. So that basically is the same workflow I would have done. So I'm happy with the process that it used. So I can kind of audit the process that it implemented. And then that kind of gives me increased faith in the kind of conclusions that it came to. And you can switch between the interrogation mode or the agent mode and kind of the default non-agent mode where you have to manually select which documents you want to use and step by step input your query. So it's nice you can kind of go back and forth between um, kind of automatically executing a several step process and then kind of having more granular control over how you investigate these documents, maybe to follow up and validate some of the conclusions that it may have made in a more high level task that it accomplished. So that's a high level overview of how to use the agent mode. Um, Pretty simple, but it's still fairly new. I think in general, for the absolute best output, it's better to do it yourself. It's better not to use this mode, but the agent mode can be very useful when it's a relatively simple task, but the task also comprises multiple steps. I think it really specifically does a good job of doing tasks which are between, I'd say, 3 to 8 steps, which is really most tasks. Most tasks can be kind of broken down into 3 to 8 steps. Anything less than 3 steps, it's probably better to just do it manually using the interrogation tab. And anything more than 8 steps, there's an increased chance that the model is going to just kind of lose the connection to what you want the output to actually be. It's essentially because of compounding errors. If it makes a mistake in one part of the process and the task has many, many steps, then that error is going to kind of cascade and the end output might look like something that you're not super happy with. So it's still a work in progress, but for certain tasks, it does very well. And it can also be a little bit instructional. You can use it to see, like if you haven't used the interrogation tab a lot, you can use this agent mode to see how you might break down a task into individual steps that can be accomplished using this tab. So that's the agent mode, and hopefully you find this is a useful addition to the interrogation tab. And I will see you later.